They say you don't really own the land, you're just borrowing it from time. But I've always believed the opposite. The moment I first laid eyes on the lot at the edge of Pine Hollow, I knew the slope behind it wasn't just a feature, it was a challenge, and I never backed down from those. The house itself was modest, just a two-story craftsman nestled into the hillside like it had grown there. I bought it 22 years ago, shortly after I retired from my work as a geotechnical engineer. I spent most of my life studying how the earth moves, how it shifts beneath highways, sneaks into basements, and if you don't respect it, swallows entire foundations. After decades of being the guy developers called too late, I wanted one thing when I retired: peace. Not palm trees or cruises, just a patch of land I could understand and protect. And that's why I built the wall. It wasn't fancy. No decorative tiles or wrought iron fencing. Just solid reinforced concrete 8 feet high at its tallest point, curved gently to guide the flow of runoff, and embedded with rebar I tied myself. I designed it with redundancy. That's something you learn after a few years in my field. Redundancy keeps people alive. You see the back half of my property bordered a steep incline of loosely packed shale and red clay. Pretty to look at, especially in fall, but dangerous after a few good rains. The original builder of the house had installed a thin timber retaining wall decades ago, probably just to satisfy code at the time. I knew it wouldn't last. The minute I moved in, I requested the survey maps, slope stability reports, and ran calculations myself. The numbers didn't lie. The hill would fail someday, maybe slowly, maybe all at once. So I started building the wall the following spring. I didn't just go to Home Depot and slap some cinder blocks together. I filed permits, paid for my own soil tests, and followed county specs down to the piece eye. The HOA didn't say a word. In fact, back then, the board president, a guy named Howard, shook my hand and said, "Looks like you know what you're doing." And I did. The wall stood solid through 5 landslide advisories, 4 hurricanes worth of runoff, and the historic Pine Hollow storm in 2013 that washed out half the neighborhood trail. My wall held, and so did the respect I'd earned for a while. But neighborhoods change. People move, others forget. Howard passed away. The old board retired. Young families moved in, tech professionals mostly. Good people, but they didn't know the land the way I did. They cared about curb appeal and symmetry. To them, the wall was a gray eyesore. To me, it was life insurance. I kept to myself mostly. After Margaret died, I didn't have much interest in barbecues or HOA social mixers. I maintained my lawn, repainted the siding every few years, and cleaned my gutters like clockwork. I wasn't a troublemaker. But I also wasn't one to sit quietly when things didn't make sense. The trouble began quietly, like a tremor beneath the surface. A new board had been elected, young, eager, and full of opinions. Brent Lasker was their new president, an ex-finance guy who ran the HOA like a hedge fund. He liked order control and uniformity. I could see it in the way he trimmed his hedges, measured unnatural, like a showroom. The first time I saw Brent eyeing the wall, I was resealing the base. He stood on the walking path above with 2 other board members, arms crossed, whispering. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe they were admiring the craftsmanship, or maybe not. That winter was unusually dry. The soil stayed crusted and brittle, the kind of condition that lulls people into a false sense of security. I kept doing my routine checks. I noticed a small separation in the seam near the north end, nothing major, but I grouted it anyway. Reinforced the spill drain. My wall was a living structure to me. I tended it like a bonsai, quietly, methodically. So when the letter arrived, I thought it was a mistake. It came in a thick envelope with the HOA logo stamped at the top. Notice of architectural violation. I remember holding it under the kitchen light, reading the words 3 times before I understood what they were saying. According to the new board, my wall had been constructed without prior HOA architectural approval. It did not comply with the community's aesthetic standards, and I was being ordered to remove it within 30 days or face escalating fines. I sat down. I actually laughed at first. It was that absurd. The wall had been there longer than half the homes on the block. It had been approved by the county, built to code, and had literal documentation on file. But the HOA didn't care about that. They weren't citing a safety issue. They were citing visual disharmony, their exact words. I drove down to the HOA office the next morning. Brent met me at the front desk with a stiff smile and a clipboard. He looked younger in person than I expected, early 30s gym body, too much cologne. "Mr. Alhollis," he said, extending his hand. "We appreciate you coming in. I assume you got the notice." "I did," I said, not shaking his hand. "And it's ridiculous." Brent kept smiling, flipping through his folder. "Unfortunately, we have very strict guidelines about unapproved structures. This wall, while functional, doesn't align with the neighborhood's updated visual plan." "It's not a pergola," I said. "It's a retaining wall. You tear that down, you won't just get disharmony, you'll get a landslide." He didn't even flinch. "We reviewed satellite imagery," he said. "And from a street-level view, it stands out dramatically. Several new residents have submitted complaints." "Let me guess," I said, leaning in. "They moved in last summer, bought their homes with full view of that wall, and now want to pretend the hill behind me is just decorative." Brent blinked. "We're asking for cooperation. You're demanding I dismantle something that protects my property, and possibly yours, because it's visually disruptive." "We'll be in touch," he said, standing. I left the office with my heart pounding. Not from rage, but from fear. Because I knew what they didn't. That wall was the only thing keeping this neighborhood from learning what a real disaster looked like. And they had just declared war on it. Brent Lasker didn't waste time making his presence felt. Within weeks of his appointment as HOA president, subtle changes started rippling through the neighborhood like tremors before a quake. The newsletters were slicker, glossier. The logo had been redesigned. A new landscaping contractor was hired to revitalize the community entrance, and the ancient oak that had stood like a sentinel at the corner of Whispering Pines and Elmview Drive was chopped down because, in Brent's words, it projected neglect. I heard about it the same way I heard most things now over the fence, through the grapevine of joggers and dog walkers who still waved at me out of habit, even if they didn't know my name. I watched them pass by, earbuds in fitness apps, buzzing, smiling as though everything in the world was fine. And maybe for them, it was. But I knew better. Brent wasn't just another over-enthusiastic HOA president with a clipboard and a vision board. He was the kind of man who got off on control. There's a breed of men like that. I knew them from my years working with federal contractors and city engineers. They come dressed in clean white collars and wield bylaws like weapons. Brent was that type. And he had power now. You could see it in the way he walked during HOA walkthroughs, flanked by his two lieutenants. Monica, the treasurer, who always seemed one passive-aggressive email away from a nervous breakdown, and Vince, the secretary, whose only qualification seemed to be that he nodded a lot. Together they canvassed the neighborhood like they were preparing for a parade. No crack in a driveway escaped notice. No holiday light strand left up past January 10th was spared. They issued fines for unmowed lawns, faded shutters, and garden gnomes deemed visually inappropriate. I kept quiet. I figured they'd burn themselves out as most new boards did. But Brent wasn't burning out. He was just getting warmed up. Then came the Community Visual Harmony Initiative, a 23-page document mailed to every resident. It read like a design manifesto: restrictions on exterior paint colors, approved lawn ornamentation, and updated standards for structural enhancements. The phrase visual flow consistency appeared more times than I could count. Tucked near the back, almost like a footnote, was a clause about non-compliant retaining walls constructed prior to 2005 being subject to review for potential removal. That was me. That was my wall. I wasn't naive. I knew this wasn't about a wall. This was about Brent marking his territory, asserting dominance. Maybe someone on the board didn't like that their new backyard view had a gray concrete barrier at the edge of their sightline. Or maybe Brent just didn't like being reminded that someone knew more than him about something. I filed an appeal immediately. Attached were my original permits dated March 2002. County engineer sign-off, soil studies. Photos showing the wall's progression, the slope behind it stabilized over time. I even included a letter from Howard, the old HOA president, thanking me for taking initiative on what he once called a ticking mud bomb. I hand-delivered the documents to the HOA office. Monica received them, her expression unreadable. "We'll bring it up at the next board meeting," she said curtly, as if I had just asked for a parking pass. That night I couldn't sleep. Not because I was scared of them, but because I knew how bureaucracy worked. I'd seen it ruin lives, twist logic into absurdity. Brent didn't need to be right. He just needed to be in charge. 2 weeks later, the response arrived. It was short, 3 paragraphs. They acknowledged receipt of my materials, but concluded that due to updated aesthetic guidelines and shifting community priorities, the wall remained in violation. I was being given 30 days to initiate its removal, or the HOA would pursue removal at my expense. I stood there in my kitchen, the letter trembling in my hand, and I felt it something deep in my chest I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not fear. Resolve. I spent the next 3 days gathering everything. I pulled out binders of data slope angle charts, photos of the hill pre- and post-wall. I printed out correspondence with Howard. I mapped the incline with overlays of rainfall records, erosion risk zones, and runoff paths. I contacted an old colleague from the State Department of Geological Safety, Alan Reyes, who agreed to draft a professional opinion if needed. Then I requested to present my case in person at the next HOA meeting. The night of the meeting, the community center was fuller than usual. Word had gotten around. People were curious. Some had heard about the wall fight. Others just liked a little drama with their Tuesday nights. Brent sat at the head of the panel table posture, perfect, flanked by Monica and Vince. He greeted me with a thin smile. "Mr. Hollis, you have 5 minutes. I nodded, placed my thick binder on the podium, and looked out at the room. A few familiar faces, most unfamiliar, all watching. "I'm not here to waste your time," I began. "I'm here to protect your homes." That got a murmur. I clicked the remote. Behind me, a slide flicked onto the projector screen. The slope, before and after. Cracks in the earth pre-wall. Vegetation loss. Water runoff patterns. I spent 32 years as a geotechnical engineer. The incline behind my property is unstable shale over clay. Anyone who's studied landslide behavior knows that's a recipe for slippage. I built the wall to prevent disaster, not to defy HOA taste. Slide after slide, I showed them how water moved down the hill, how vegetation struggled to take root, how the original wall, now long gone, had begun to fail by the early 2000s. I showed them the blueprints of my structure, photos of the 2013 storm, the way my wall had held. I paused at the end, then looked directly at Brent. "You take that wall down, you won't just change the view, you'll destabilize the land. And if that slope gives way, it won't just hit my property. It'll sweep into the community green space, across the clubhouse lawn, and down to the lower streets. That includes your tennis courts, your picnic area, and some of your homes." Silence. Brent shifted. "Thank you, Mr. Hollis. The board will deliberate and notify you of our decision." That was it. No questions, no discussion. I packed my things, nodded to a few neighbors who offered sympathetic glances, and walked out into the cold night air. For a moment, I let myself hope. Maybe, just maybe, logic had landed. But hope's a fragile thing. The demolition crew arrived 12 days later. They didn't even knock on the door. I was out back pruning the rose bushes Margaret planted the year before she passed, when I heard the low rumble of a diesel engine idling out front. I stepped around the corner of the house just in time to see 2 trucks from a local demolition company pull up, white lettering on their doors. Turnkey Site Services. Trailers loaded with jackhammers, wheelbarrows, concrete saws. Men in safety vests hopped out like it was just another Tuesday. One of them glanced at me, then headed straight for the retaining wall. "Hey," I called, walking down the slope toward the fence. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" A stocky man with a clipboard turned to me. "You, Mr. Hollis." I nodded slowly. "We've been hired by the Hut Pine Hollow HOA to begin removal of an unauthorized structure. Shouldn't take more than a few days." My stomach dropped. "You mean the wall?" He looked back over his shoulder and pointed. "That's the only structure on the order." I looked past him at the wall. My wall. Quiet. Steady. Innocent. The slope behind it loomed like a sleeping giant, and these fools were about to yank the pin out of the grenade. I stormed back inside and grabbed the file folder from my office. Copies of the permits, the appeal, the photos, the geological reports. I had everything. I called the HOA office as I moved. No answer. Voicemail. I left a sharp, cold message. I marched back outside and handed the documents to the man with the clipboard. "You can't touch that wall," I said. "It's permitted, it's county approved, and it's structurally critical. That hill will move if you tear it down." He didn't even look at the papers. Take it up with your HOA, sir. We've got orders. Then show me a court order, I snapped. Because unless you have legal authority to touch that wall, this is destruction of private property. He shifted slightly, his tone less sure. We were told it's common ground now. No, it's not, I said. Survey markers are still there. That wall sits entirely on my lot. You bring a machine in here and you're trespassing. He radioed someone. There was a pause. Eventually, one of the HOA board members pulled up in a sleek black SUV Brent. He got out like he was walking into a business meeting. No hard hat, no clipboard, just that smirk. Mr. Hollis, he said, hands in his pockets. You were notified. You ignored the county permits. He shrugged. Permits expire. And this board has the authority to determine structural compliance under revised community policy. That wall isn't your jurisdiction. It is, he said, if it affects community aesthetics and shared land value. I stepped closer. If you tear that wall down and something happens, I will hold you personally responsible. And I have the documentation to make it stick. Brent didn't blink. Let's hope nothing happens then. And with that, he turned away. That afternoon, they started cutting into it. I stood and watched as they began hammering at the upper corner, dust flying, the sharp echo of stone cracking, ripping through the quiet street like gunshots. I could see the slope behind it naked now in places where ivy had once clung. The ground didn't protest, not yet, but I knew. I could feel the pressure release. The earth wasn't just dirt. It remembered. Neighbors came by once or two at a time. Some shook their heads in disbelief. A few stayed quiet, unsure what side they were on. A couple offered to bring me lemonade like this was some kind of sad parade. 3 days in the wall was reduced to rubble. They carted off the concrete, filled in the gap with loosely packed dirt, and put up a small wooden retaining barrier barely knee-high, probably more for looks than function. I stared at it like a ticking clock, a bluff. I called the county inspector's office, hoping someone would intervene. They said their hands were tied. It was private property, unless formally contested in court. I called Alan Reyes. He agreed to come out the following weekend to do a professional evaluation. He didn't like what he saw. He ran his hand along the exposed hill, brow furrowed. This slope is compromised, Jack, he said. You can see the tension cracks forming along the ridgeline. They broke the groundwater seal. It's only a matter of time. How much time, I asked. He glanced at the sky. Depends. But you better hope it doesn't rain. It did. Not even a week later, the forecast turned. A cold front moved down from the north, collided with Gulf moisture, and the sky opened like a faucet. I lay awake listening to the rain hammering against my roof. I thought about Margaret, about the last storm we sat through together wrapped in that blue wool blanket, her hand on mine. She always trusted me to keep us safe. But she wasn't here now, and I wasn't sure I could do the same for anyone anymore. The following morning, I put on my boots and went to inspect the slope. There it was, a thin brown rivulet cutting across the surface, streaming downward faster than it should have been. The soil was sloughing off in small slides like tiny rehearsals for something bigger. I took photos. I sent them to Brent. No response. I printed them out, hand-delivered them to Monica's house. Her teenage son opened the door and just stared at me like I was crazy. They need to see this, I told him. It's not about me anymore. It's about what's coming. That night, I slept in my recliner boots, still on. I couldn't shake the feeling. Like an old animal sensing something before the sky turns. 3 days of rain. By the end of the third day, the runoff trench I'd dug near my foundation filled to capacity. The wooden barrier at the base of the slope looked warped. A crack had formed just above the clubhouse lawn, wide enough to swallow a tennis ball. Still no one listened. Still the HOA did nothing. And then the hill moved. The first thing I felt wasn't fear, it was vibration. A low, deep hum that rolled beneath the soles of my boots like thunder underground. I was on my front porch that morning, mug in hand, eyes on the hill watching the mist drift over the ridgeline. Everything was soaked. The earth glistened like a sponge stretched past its breaking point. Then the vibration turned into a sound subtle at first, like gravel shifting in a wheelbarrow, but rising, building. The kind of sound you never forget once you've heard it. I dropped the mug. It shattered at my feet, but I didn't flinch. I was already running. The ground behind my house, where the wall used to be, groaned, then cracked open. A fracture tore across the upper slope like a lightning bolt etched into the earth. And then the hillside collapsed. Not all at once, not like in the movies. It started with a small surge mud rock root bundles spilling forward like wet cement. But then the pressure behind it surged, and the entire face of the hill buckled and let go. A rolling wave of brown thunder surged down, tearing out shrubs, toppling 2 young pines someone had planted last year, and slamming into the back of the HOA's clubhouse with a sound like a bomb had gone off. I stood frozen for a moment, just breathing, watching. Then I grabbed my phone. I called 911 first. Landslide, I told the operator. Pine Hollow subdivision, behind the community clubhouse. It's bad. Real bad. Then I called Brent. He didn't answer. Then Monica. Straight to voicemail. I didn't waste more time. I pulled on my parka, grabbed the emergency binder from my home office, and marched across the soggy yards to the disaster zone. It was chaos. Residents were gathered near the greenbelt yelling, filming with their phones. One of the tennis courts was buried. The back third of the clubhouse had collapsed, windows blown out, drywall hanging like wet paper. Brent's Tesla, parked right beside the building as always, was half submerged in thick, dark sludge. Only the roof and part of the rear spoiler were visible. I scanned the crowd. Brent wasn't there yet, but Vince was. He stood near the collapsed fence line, pale and speechless. I walked straight to him. "This is exactly what I warned you about," I said. He looked at me with wide, glassy eyes, like I'd just summoned the storm myself. What are we supposed to do?" he stammered. "Evacuate the area," I said. "The slope's not done moving. There's still hydrostatic pressure building behind the upper ridge. If you don't clear people out of here now, you'll have more than just a damaged building on your hands." Right then, sirens cut through the air. Fire trucks, emergency management, vehicles. I exhaled. At least someone had listened. The officials took over quickly, cordoning off the area, shuttling people away from the slope, taping off access points. I stayed nearby, ready to answer questions, and sure enough, within an hour, a young man in a rain-streaked windbreaker with County Geotech across the chest walked over. "You Jack Hollis?" he asked. "That's me." He offered a firm handshake. "I'm Wad Derek Lyons. Got your name flagged in the old stabilization reports. You built the wall." "Yes, I did." He looked at the destruction and shook his head. "This didn't have to happen." "No," I said, voice even. "It didn't." We talked slope geometry, saturation thresholds, subsurface layers. It felt good in a strange way, talking shop again even in the midst of disaster. Then a voice broke through the commotion, shrill and angry. "What the hell is he doing here?" "Brent." He shoved his way past a barrier rain jacket, flapping like a cape face, flushed. His sneakers were already splattered with mud, but he didn't seem to care. "You," he said, jabbing a finger at me. "This is your fault." Everyone turned. Even the firefighters stopped what they were doing. My jaw clenched. "You tore down the wall." "It was in violation. It was a safety structure. It was an eyesore. You didn't follow our rules." A silence fell over the crowd, and then Derek stepped between us. "Sir," he said to Brent calmly, "we have structural reports on file indicating that wall was a critical retaining feature. Its removal destabilized the hill." Brent laughed a short, high-pitched bark of disbelief. "This is insane. You're blaming me." Derek didn't flinch. "We'll be conducting a full investigation, but preliminary indicators suggest negligence on the part of the HOA, especially given the documented warnings." "I warned you," I said quietly. "I begged you not to touch it. I stood in front of your board." Brent was turning red. "We followed protocol. We have minutes. We voted." "You ignored the engineering data," I snapped. "You dismissed 20 years of experience because you didn't like the way concrete looked in your backyard." Monica appeared then, looking stricken, a folder clutched to her chest. She approached Brent, but didn't speak. Just handed him a packet, one I recognized. My report. The photos, the soil charts, all of it. He flipped through them, lips pressed tight, as if seeing them for the first time. Maybe he was. Maybe for the first time. He was realizing that there were things outside his control. That aesthetics couldn't hold back the earth. The next day, I got a knock on my door. It was a woman in her late 40s, dark coat, notepad in hand. She introduced herself as Rachel Connors, a reporter for the local news outlet. "I've been assigned to cover the landslide," she said, "and your name keeps coming up." I invited her in, made coffee, sat her at Margaret's old reading table. She asked questions. I answered. She recorded our conversation. By the next morning, the headline read, "Retired engineer warned HOA weeks before landslide." It spread faster than I expected. Comments poured in. People from the community reached out. Some apologized. Some just asked questions. For once, they were listening. And Brent, he vanished from public view. No interviews, no statements. The HOA office issued a generic release citing unforeseen geological instability and regrettable property loss. But no apology. Not yet. But that was okay. I was just getting started. The morning they finished clearing the last of the rubble, the rain had finally stopped. The air still held that heavy metallic scent that lingers after days of saturation, like the earth itself was trying to remember how to breathe again. I stood in my backyard, arms folded, looking out at the jagged line where my wall used to be. The hillside now exposed raw, and weeping felt almost indecent, like someone had ripped the skin off something sacred. Turnkeys' trucks were parked crooked along the curb, their tires sunk deep into the soggy grass. The last of the demolition crew loaded chunks of broken concrete into a flatbed. None of them looked at me. I didn't expect them to. A flimsy wooden fence, if you could call it that, had been installed where the wall once stood. Maybe 3 feet high, barely staked. It leaned already, rain having warped the baseboards before they even dried. Aesthetic compliance, Brent had called it. A more harmonious visual profile. God help us all. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rip it down with my bare hands, nail by nail, and throw the pieces into his meticulously landscaped koi pond. But I didn't. I stood still, because I knew it wasn't over. That afternoon, I went to the shed, pulled out my gear, notebooks, old slope maps, my field boots, a half-rusted clinometer I hadn't used in years. I set it all out on the dining table, dusted each item like an old soldier preparing his uniform. I wasn't going to let this go. Not because of pride, not because they ignored me, because people were in danger, and because now the soil was angry. That night, I walked to the hill again. The ground squelched underfoot, soft and unstable. I traced the old runoff channels, now clogged with debris and mulch. Up high, just below the ridgeline, I found the worst of it, a long diagonal tension crack, maybe 4 inches wide, and deep enough that I couldn't see the bottom. It wasn't just a crack. It was a message. The land was shifting, and fast. I took photos in the dying light, the flash throwing sharp contrast between the brown earth and the shredded root systems poking from the slope like broken bones. I turned around to find a light flicker on from a house a few yards up. A woman knew I didn't know her name, stood in her kitchen window watching me. I raised my hand slightly. She didn't wave back, just closed the blinds. That night I emailed Brent. No anger, just evidence. Subject: critical safety concerns. Former wall site. Brent. Attached are photos taken this evening of the current state of the slope. Please note the presence of significant surface cracking, loss of ground cohesion, and blockage of runoff systems. Given the expected continued precipitation, these conditions pose imminent danger not only to my property, but also to adjacent HOA-owned structures, including the clubhouse and tennis courts. I strongly urge a reevaluation by a certified geotechnical engineer. As you are aware, prior stabilization was designed to mitigate precisely this scenario. Its removal without engineering replacement puts the community at legal and environmental risk. Jack Hollis, retired geotechnical engineer. No reply, not even a red receipt. I printed a copy and hand-delivered it to the HOA office the next morning, sliding it through the drop slot. Monica saw me from her car, but didn't say a word. I waited. Days passed. The rain kept coming in waves, the forecast a cruel joke, intermittent showers turning into all-day saturations. The slope grew more sluggish. Cracks widened. The soil started to bleed out. And then came the moment I dreaded. A knock at my door. 2 men in uniforms. Not police, city code enforcement. One of them was maybe 25 with a clipboard too big for his hands. The other was older, expressionless. Mr. Hollis, the younger one asked. I nodded. We've received reports of an unauthorized inspection operation occurring on common HOA ground. Specifically, unsanctioned environmental assessment activity. I stared at them. You mean me walking the slope behind my property? That's the area in question, yes. I laughed once sharp. That's not HOA property, it's mine. There's a boundary dispute on file, the older man cut in. We've been asked to request that you refrain from further access until it's resolved. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, then said, wait here. I returned with my file folder, the one I'd kept since the day I bought the house. I flipped to the survey plat, the recorded easement, the slope map with legal lot lines highlighted. Here, I said, tapping the map. That entire ridge is on my parcel. What the HOA built down their clubhouse courts benches, that's their business. But the land behind me, where the wall stood, that's mine. The younger man glanced at it. He didn't really know what he was looking at. The older one nodded slowly like a man who didn't want trouble, but could smell it coming. We'll note your position, he said, but we have to report this back. Do that, I said. And while you're at it, let them know I have photos, slope analysis, and a signed affidavit from Alan Reyes, former chief state geologist. They left without another word. By then, word had spread. Some neighbors, mostly the ones who knew the lay of the land, started to ask quiet questions. Mrs. Dupree from 2 houses over stopped by with banana bread and said, I heard what they did to your wall. I always felt safer knowing it was there. I thanked her. It meant more than she knew. Then came the night I couldn't ignore the sound. It was after midnight. The house was quiet. I sat reading an old Louis L'Amour novel, something Margaret used to laugh about. And then from outside a low creak, like something groaning under weight. I grabbed my flashlight, threw on my coat, and stepped into the dark. The crack had widened. Rainwater streamed down the slope like veins. One of the young pines at the crest had started to tilt roots exposed on one side. The flimsy wooden fence was already leaning outward. I looked down towards the clubhouse. Lights were still on Brent's Tesla, parked in its usual spot. I dialed his number again. He didn't answer, so I sent him one more message, short and final. Brent, the slope is shifting. I've warned you repeatedly. If you continue to ignore expert advisement, the liability will be yours. Consider this formal notice. Jack. I watched the tree for a moment longer. Then I went inside, locked the door, and sat in the dark, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I dozed off sometime around 4, only to jolt awake at the sound of thunder rolling low and long in the distance. The kind that doesn't crack, just rumbles slow and steady, like a warning from the gut of the earth. The rain had returned more insistent this time. It hammered against the roof in staccato bursts, then softened like breath catching in a throat. I sat at the kitchen table watching the weather radar on my laptop, the colors pulsing across the screen. Green turned to yellow, edged with red. A band of storms was settling right over Pine Hollow like a vulture perched for a feast. At 6:23 a.m., I walked the perimeter again. I knew every stone and slope line of that hill by heart. But now it was different. The earth didn't feel dormant anymore. It felt coiled as if alive. The ground was slick, even the weeds leaned downslope. Along the path where runoff had etched lines, the water no longer just trickled, it surged. At the base of the exposed slope near where my old wall once stood, the soft swell of mud was beginning to creep forward. It was just inches, but I knew what that meant. Movement. I documented everything. Photos, videos. I even recorded myself speaking into the camera, date time, rainfall estimate, visual evidence of further degradation. Not because I needed it, but because I knew how this would play out in court, if it came to that. And deep down, I was starting to believe it would. By 8:00 a.m., a group of contractors had shown up at the clubhouse, some crew sent to lay sandbags around the tennis courts. I approached them. You boys got engineering approval for this, I asked. The foreman, a wiry man in his 50s with sharp eyes, glanced at me. We were told to lay the bags, where water's pooling. HOA hired us this morning. They tell you the slope behind this place is about to collapse. He looked up at the ridge. Didn't say nothing about that. Well, I said if I were you, I wouldn't spend too much time right there. I handed him a printout of the slope image I took that morning. This is where you're standing. And that crack I pointed to the jagged line. That's a pre-failure fissure. You've got hydrostatic buildup and no retaining force. If that goes, it'll take all of this with it. He looked at the paper, then back at the clubhouse. Jesus. You boys might want to pause work and tell your boss to call an engineer, fast. He nodded once and walked off radioing someone. I didn't wait to hear what came next. I was done warning, done pleading. Later that afternoon, I received a formal email from the HOA's legal liaison. Not Brent, not Monica. A lawyer. Dear Mr. Hollis, in light of recent events and in recognition of your documented concerns, the HOA is prepared to conduct a third-party assessment of the slope integrity behind your residence. Please be advised that this review does not indicate liability or wrongdoing on the part of the HOA. Assessment is scheduled for Friday, 9:00 a.m. Kindly remain available for questions at that time. Sincerely, Trevor N. Caldwell, HOA legal consultant. I laughed out loud. After all the warnings, all the reports, all the science, they ignored. They were finally hiring someone to look. Friday. It was Tuesday. They were giving the slope 3 more days. 3 more days of rain. By Wednesday morning, word had gotten out. I heard whispers among neighbors, cautious nods. When I walked down to check my mailbox, Mrs. Dupree told me someone had started a group chat to discuss emergency preparedness. Another neighbor, I think her name was Hannah, mentioned a petition circulating to pause all HOA decisions regarding land modification. The tide was turning slowly, but I knew it might be too late. That night, I received a knock at the door. It was Monica. I hadn't seen her in days. She stood awkwardly on the porch, hair-damp mascara smudged slightly. Not the clipped corporate woman I was used to. She looked tired and afraid. She began. I wanted to say I read your reports again, all of them. She paused. I'm sorry. The words hung between us. I stepped aside and let her in. She sat at the kitchen table, same place Rachel the reporter had days ago. I poured her tea, watched her wrap her hands around the mug like it was something to hold on to. I told Brent we needed to listen to you weeks ago, she said quietly. He wouldn't hear it. Said we'd lose control if we backed down. I nodded. It's not about control anymore. She nodded. I know. That's why I'm here. I'm resigning. Tomorrow. That startled me. Resigning. I won't be a part of this anymore. Not when people could get hurt. I've already contacted the city. They're sending someone regardless of what the HOA wants. I studied her for a moment. There was sincerity in her voice. Regret, too. You did the right thing, I said, even if it came late. She left without asking for forgiveness, which I respected. The following morning, Thursday, brought wind. Fierce biting gusts that stripped loose debris from the hilltop and scattered it down into the basin. More rain. By now, the slope wasn't just unstable. It was saturated beyond its ability to hold. I could see it in the way the trees leaned. In the new surface, bulges, like silent eruptions, pressing upward from beneath. I packed a go bag, just in case. I slept in my clothes again, boots by the door, phone fully charged. At 3:11 a.m., a crack split the night like a rifle shot. Then another. Then the roar. Not thunder, earth, moving. The roar was like nothing I'd ever heard. Not in war zones, not on construction sites, not in the worst floods I documented in my career. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence. A force that filled the air, the ground, even my lungs. It was the planet unzipping its skin and releasing everything it had been holding back. I was already on my feet when the windows began to rattle. Outside, the darkness looked different. Not still, not quiet, but alive. Trees swayed violently, not from wind, but from the shifting below them. I flicked on my floodlights and yanked the back door open. What I saw stole the air from my chest. The hill was collapsing, not in pieces this time. Not like a trickle of mud or a small soil shift. The entire slope was coming down in waves as if someone had cracked the spine of the land and let gravity drink deep. A wall of earth roots, sodden clay, and broken branches rushed forward, gaining speed, pulling entire shrubs into its maw. And at the bottom, in the crosshairs, stood the HOA clubhouse lights still on Brent's silver Tesla, gleaming faintly in the glow. The landslide struck like a freight train. The back of the clubhouse crumpled as if it were made of tissue paper. The windows blew out in a flash of glass and mud, and the force shoved the structure off its foundation, collapsing half the roof. The Tesla vanished under a wave of debris. Screams erupted from across the street, residents standing on porches, flashlights jerking back and forth like panicked eyes. I could hear someone shouting Brent's name. Someone else was crying. I grabbed my radio and tuned to the county emergency band. Landslide confirmed, a dispatcher was saying. Multiple structures impacted. Responders en route. Repeat full slope failure in Pine Hollow units responding. I ran out into the storm, heart-pounding feet sinking into the saturated earth. My training kicked in. I didn't think I just moved. A few others were running too, neighbors barefoot, some in robes. A man I barely knew from 3 houses down met me at the edge of the destruction. Brent was inside, he shouted. Where I called. He was working late in the office. The front of the clubhouse was partially intact. Mud pressed against the walls like a siege. A sliver of roof sagged, but hadn't yet given way. I could see movement through the blown-out windows, light, a flicker, a shadow. Call out, I yelled. A faint voice answered, help, I'm in here. Brent, I called. Jack. I couldn't believe it. I climbed the slope, carefully slipping once, nearly going down on my side. The mud sucked at my boots like it didn't want to let go. I reached what was left of the front entrance, half covered in debris, and pulled on the warped door. "Stay back," I called. "I'm coming in." Inside, the air was thick with dust and wet insulation. A light flickered from a cracked fixture. Brent sat on the floor behind a half-collapsed desk, blood running down one temple, his suit soaked and torn. He looked at me like I was a ghost. I didn't know," he stammered. "I didn't think it would—" I ignored him. "Can you walk?" "I think so." I reached out and helped him up. He groaned, favoring one leg. I pulled his arm around my shoulders and began guiding him out. The building groaned ominously, the mud pressing harder. Halfway out the door, another surge came. The ground behind this clubhouse dropped again, pulling the rear wall down with it. I tightened my grip on Brent and yelled, "Move now!" We staggered into the open as the final collapse struck the building, collapsing inward in a roaring moan. People screamed behind us. Once we were clear, I let Brent down near the curb, where a paramedic team had just arrived. They took over, checking his vitals. His face was pale, streaked with mud and shame. As I stood there, dripping and shaking, Monica rushed up to me. "Oh my God," she gasped. "You saved him." "I saved him from himself," I muttered. Emergency lights flashed across the neighborhood now, fire engines, EMTs, police. A news van had already pulled up by the main gate. They moved fast these days. I stood on the edge of it all and watched the neighborhood wake up to its new reality. The slope was gone. The clubhouse gone. The HOA's symbol of pride and power buried beneath their own arrogance. An officer approached me, young and nervous. "Sir, are you Jack Hollis?" "I am." "I need to ask you a few questions about the warnings, the reports, the prior documentation." "I've got everything you need," I said. "Follow me." Back inside my house, I laid the binder on the kitchen table. Opened it. Chronological logs, dates, emails, photographs, soil test results, the engineer's letter, the survey maps. The officer blinked, impressed. "You were prepared." I was ignored. I corrected him. He nodded. "Not anymore." By sunrise, the media was everywhere. Drones buzzed overhead. Reporters interviewed neighbors who suddenly remembered all the times they'd questioned the wall's removal. Monica issued a statement acknowledging severe oversights. Brent was loaded into an ambulance. His eyes met mine once as the door shut. I didn't wave. That afternoon, I received a call from Rachel Connors, the reporter who first interviewed me. "I don't think we expected a follow-up," she said quietly. "But the story's gone statewide. The city's opening a formal investigation into the HOA's liability." "Good," I said. "You don't sound surprised." "I'm not." "Would you be willing to do a second interview?" I paused, then nodded even though she couldn't see. "Yes," I said. It's time people understood the weight of ignoring the ground they live on. That night, the rain finally stopped. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was reflective, like the land itself was grieving too. I stood at the back of my property, flashlight off, just watching the slope, now leveled, collapsed into itself. And I whispered into the wind, "I warned you." By the following morning, Brent's face was on every screen in Pine Hollow, and not because he wanted it to be. Local channels replayed drone footage of the landslide from every angle, capturing the moment his beloved clubhouse vanished beneath tons of sliding earth. His photo, taken from a LinkedIn profile, where he once looked confident and polished, now accompanied headlines like HOA, ignored warnings, community devastated, and engineer predicted collapse weeks before disaster. I didn't smile when I saw it. I didn't gloat, but I also didn't look away. The first official knock came just after 9:00 a.m. Two representatives from the county's Department of Public Works arrived with clipboards, laser levels, and a drone. They introduced themselves, Sandra Kim and Mason Rodriguez, and explained that a multi-agency investigation had been launched, building code violations, HOA overreach, public safety negligence. Mr. Hollis, Sandra said, "We've reviewed your documentation. Frankly, it's some of the most detailed, precise civil analysis I've ever seen from a private citizen." "I used to be in the business," I said. Mason looked up from the drone controls. "You sure kept every receipt." "I had a feeling I'd need them someday." She nodded slowly. "Well, that day came, and it saved lives." By mid-morning, county vehicles lined the street. Engineers in neon vests walked the slope, measuring soil displacement, taking core samples. A forensic geologist arrived with a portable scanner. The place looked more like a state crime scene than a suburban greenbelt, and in many ways it was. Meanwhile, the HOA board was unraveling. Monica officially submitted her resignation by noon. Vince followed within the hour. Rumors swirled about emergency elections, emergency funding, and emergency meetings, none of which could undo the damage already done. Brent, still recovering from a concussion and a fractured ankle, had checked himself out of the hospital that morning. He was spotted leaving his home with two men in suits his lawyers most assumed. Around 2:00 p.m., I received a courier-delivered envelope from the HOA's legal counsel. Inside was a 5-page letter riddled with legalese effectively stating that the HOA was not liable for naturally occurring geologic phenomena and had acted within its discretionary authority. I snorted. Naturally occurring. I picked up the phone and dialed Alan Reyes. "You see the coverage?" I asked him. "Jack, I'm in Nevada." And even I saw it. The footage is being analyzed in geotech forums like a case study in hubris. "Can I quote you on that?" He laughed. "Anytime. What do you need?" "I want to file a civil claim," I said. "Not just for my own damage, but for the cost of restoring the land for every person they endangered and for what they did to this community. You've got standing. You've got evidence. And most importantly, you've got motive backed by pure, indisputable data. I want them to feel the weight of it." Alan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll write a full affidavit and get on a flight." The next few days unfolded like a courtroom drama before the courtroom even opened. The HOA issued a second statement, this one slightly more contrite, admitting there may have been oversights and a need to review procedural adherence in future structural decisions. They still didn't say the word sorry. They still didn't mention me by name. Didn't matter. The community knew. My mailbox overflowed with handwritten letters. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to dropped off coffee casseroles notes with things like, "Thank you for standing your ground," and "We should have listened." For the first time in a decade, I didn't feel like a relic hiding behind a concrete barrier. I felt seen. Then came the letter that changed everything. A woman named Lynn Hastings, who lived in Lot 17B. A few houses down the slope contacted me through her lawyer. Her backyard had partially collapsed into the ravine, and her insurance provider had denied the claim citing preventable failure due to known warnings. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to testify in her case against the HOA. I said yes. She wasn't the only one. By the end of the week, 8 homeowners had formed a coalition. All of them had suffered some degree of property loss damage or trauma. All had received copies of my slope analysis, the warnings I'd sent. All of them were now plaintiffs in a class action lawsuit, Hollis et al. Versus Pine Hollow Homeowners Association. The filing landed like a thunderclap. Rachel Connors, the reporter, reached out again for a follow-up segment. She came by with a small crew, this time filmed me standing by the ruins of where the wall once was. "Do you think this could have been prevented?" she asked, camera trained on my face. "Yes," I said plainly. And they were told exactly how to prevent it. They just didn't want to listen. "Do you feel vindicated?" I paused. "I feel tired," I admitted. "But yeah. I also feel like the land finally spoke louder than politics." That night, the story aired across the region, then syndicated statewide. Messages began pouring in from other HOAs across the country, homeowners in Florida, Colorado, Arizona. People thanking me for standing up. Some even asking for advice. One man from Utah wrote, "They're trying to remove a retaining pond I built on my land for flood control. After seeing your story, I'm documenting everything." I wrote back, told him to hold the line, told him to make copies of everything. Brent, meanwhile, went radio silent. The lawyers representing the HOA tried to file a motion to dismiss the case, but the county countered with a separate investigation of their own. There were whispers of potential criminal negligence. Monica agreed to testify. Vince, too. Both handed over board meeting transcripts, some of which included direct quotes from Brent laughing off my reports. By the end of the month, the court date was set. It wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a reckoning, and I was ready. The courtroom wasn't grand, just a clean, functional space tucked inside the downtown municipal building. No marble columns, no sweeping staircases, just rows of worn wooden benches and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. But to me, it felt like a battlefield. And for the first time in years, I walked into one, not as a retired man, not as a recluse, or that guy with the wall, but as someone demanding to be heard. The plaintiffs, myself, Lynn Hastings, and 6 others were seated together. Our attorneys organized and prepared. We had documents, stacked high soil analysis emails, community letters, expert affidavits, and truth. We had that too. On the other side of the aisle sat Brent, arms crossed, flanked by two attorneys in slick suits. His face was stony jaw, locked so tightly I thought it might crack. He wouldn't look at me. Fine by me. The judge, a woman named Marisol DeWitt, presided with a no-nonsense tone that immediately cut through the drama. She had read the briefs, understood the stakes, and made it clear this wasn't about community politics. This was about cause and consequence. Our lead attorney, a sharp man named Dennis Lake, began by outlining our claim that the HOA under Brent's leadership had knowingly dismantled a critical safety structure, despite professional warnings resulting in property damage, emotional distress, and endangered lives. He read from Brent's own emails. He displayed photos of the wall before and after. He read aloud the text of the violation notice sent to me, emphasizing the language of aesthetic disharmony over safety. Then he called me to the stand. I took a breath and walked to the witness box, gripping the railing for a moment before sitting. "Mr. Hollis," Dennis began, "can you tell the court your background?" "I'm a retired geotechnical engineer, 32 years in the field. Most of that working on state-funded infrastructure projects involving slope stability, landslide prevention, and flood control." "And did you design and build the concrete retaining wall on your property?" "Yes." "With permits filed through the county, inspections passed, and documentation filed with the HOA at the time. Why did you build the wall?" "To prevent slope failure. The soil behind my property is a known hazard, loose shale red clay, high saturation risk. Without that wall, collapse was inevitable." "And did you warn the HOA?" "More than once," I said. "I submitted reports, stood before the board, explained the risks. I begged them not to proceed with demolition." Dennis nodded. Then he turned to the courtroom's projector screen and brought up a series of images. My wall standing firm during a 2013 storm. The same area weeks after demolition. The slope beginning to crack. Then the aftermath, mud swallowing the clubhouse, Brent's Tesla barely visible under sludge. The HOA's response was to claim your wall was an unauthorized visual disturbance. "In your professional opinion, was that valid?" "No," I said flatly. "It was a safety measure, and tearing it down is what led to the landslide." Brent's attorney stood for cross-examination. A woman named Talia Price, young, aggressive, with a tone like she'd just stepped out of a legal drama. "Mr. Hollis," she began, "isn't it true that you failed to obtain HOA architectural approval for the wall before construction?" The HOA at that time verbally acknowledged the need and thanked me. There was no formal denial, nor any objection in writing. "But you didn't submit the request through the current version of their approval process." "Because it didn't exist then," I replied. "That process was created more than a decade later." She narrowed her eyes. "So technically your wall was non-compliant." "Technically it saved lives," I said, my voice calm. There were murmurs in the courtroom. Talia shifted tactics. "Isn't it possible, Mr. Hollis, that the landslide was due to excessive rainfall, something no one could have predicted?" I looked straight at the judge. Excessive rainfall doesn't cause slopes to fail on its own. It exposes weaknesses that already existed. The removal of the retaining wall destabilized the slope. It was a catalyst, not a coincidence. Dennis smiled faintly. Talia sat down. Then came the testimony from Alan Reyes. He walked in wearing a corduroy jacket, his gray beard trimmed neatly. His voice, firm and deliberate, laid out the soil mechanics behind the collapse. He showed moisture index charts, slope gradients, calculated loss of shear strength. It was textbook, irrefutable. Had the wall remained in place, Alan concluded the slope would have held. When Brent took the stand, the air in the courtroom turned heavy. He sat rigid, speaking with clipped precision. His lawyer guided him through the usual explanations. The board had acted in good faith. They believed they were improving the community. Aesthetics mattered to home values. The wall violated guidelines. "Did you personally read Mr. Hollis's engineering reports?" the judge asked suddenly. Brent hesitated. "I was briefed on them." "But you didn't read them yourself." "No, Your Honor. And yet you authorized the demolition." "I believed we had the authority." "That's not what I asked," she said coolly. Brent faltered. "No, I didn't read them." That was the moment. The courtroom was silent, but the silence said everything. The judge recessed for deliberation. It took 3 days. When we returned, Judge DeWitt addressed the court with a gravity that made even the reporters put down their phones. The HOA, under the leadership of Mr. Brent Lasker, acted with gross negligence in dismissing professional warnings, removing a structurally critical wall, and endangering residents. The court finds the HOA liable for damages totaling $2.4 million to be distributed among plaintiffs, with additional punitive damages levied for reckless endangerment. Brent stared at the floor. I closed my eyes. It was done. Not revenge, not victory. Just the truth finally honored. Outside, cameras flashed. Reporters swarmed. Neighbors clapped me on the back, shook my hand. One elderly woman with a cane hugged me tight and whispered, "Thank you for saving us." That night, I went home and opened the cabinet where I kept Margaret's things. I found the blue wool blanket folded just how she'd left it. I wrapped it around my shoulders and sat in her old rocker, staring out at the hill, now reshaped but settling. The land had spoken, and this time the world had listened. The weeks following the verdict passed in a kind of quiet haze, not from exhaustion, but from something deeper, something that felt like reverence. The neighborhood had changed. Not just physically, the collapsed slope, the crater where the clubhouse used to be. The tennis court swallowed whole, but emotionally, communally. People looked each other in the eyes now. They spoke in softer tones, and for the first time in a long time, they listened. A recovery committee formed, and though I hadn't planned to get involved, they asked me to consult. Not as a plaintiff, not as a witness, just as Jack Hollis, the man who knew the earth. I accepted. We held the first meeting on a folding table in a neighbor's garage. No titles, no agendas, just residents from young couples to retirees, all sitting shoulder to shoulder, passing around coffee in mismatched mugs. Someone brought donuts. Someone brought a folder labeled Reinforcement Options, Native Landscaping. They wanted my opinion on every drawing, every plan, every soil retention suggestion. "We don't want another clubhouse," someone said. "We want something safer, smarter." So we started sketching not blueprints, but intentions. We met with county engineers and landscape architects. We walked the slope together, measuring not just feet and inches, but feelings, where people used to play, where children sledded in the winter, where fireflies clustered in summer. There was grief there, but also rebirth. The settlement funds covered the essentials: structural stabilization, erosion barriers, slope-safe planting. But the community raised more online, in bake sales, through quiet donations tucked into envelopes. We rebuilt the hill as a memorial to humility and resilience. A series of tiered terraces now covered the once torn earth, layered with stone-reinforced steel mesh and native grasses that took root quickly. Instead of fences, we planted shrubs. Instead of tennis courts, we installed a quiet walking path lined with benches and story markers telling what happened, not to shame, but to remember. On one of the benches, they mounted a plaque. I didn't know about it until the unveiling. It read, "The Hollis Bench, in honor of listening before acting. For Jack Hollis, who saw what others wouldn't and stood when others wouldn't." I stood beside Monica that day. She looked healthier, more herself. She'd gone back to teaching middle school science. "I had that quote etched in myself for weeks," she whispered. "I hope it's okay." I nodded, eyes damp. "It's more than okay." Brent never returned to Pine Hollow. Rumors swirled he'd moved to Florida, taken a job in private equity, maybe changed his name. I didn't care. He was a ghost now. The community had already buried what he represented: vanity over safety, ego over expertise. As spring approached, life returned. Children played on the new trails. Dogs ran freely in the open space. And people looked at that slope, not with fear, but with respect. The kind you can't legislate or regulate. The kind you only earn when something nearly breaks you. I spent mornings tending my garden again. Roses like Margaret planted. I built a small gazebo near the rear edge of my property, where the old wall had once begun. It wasn't a defense anymore, it was an invitation. I'd sit there in the evening, drinking coffee or scotch, depending on the day, and watching the hillside settle into itself. Sometimes people joined me. Strangers at first, then neighbors, then friends. They'd ask questions about soil, about history, about how to plant something that wouldn't just look good, but last. One young man, newly moved in with his wife and toddler, asked me what it felt like to watch the wall come down. I paused. "It felt like betrayal," I said. But in hindsight, it had to happen. Sometimes people need to break the thing that keeps them safe to understand why it mattered. He nodded slowly. His daughter ran along the gravel path nearby, chasing a butterfly. But we rebuilt it better, he said. Yes, I said. And now you're the wall. His eyes met mine. What do you mean? You'll be the one who knows, who watches, who steps forward when the next Brent comes knocking. That night, I found the old blueprint of the original wall tucked in the back of a drawer. I framed it not as a reminder of what was lost, but what stood. The line of reinforcement, the line of defense, the line I had drawn and defended alone until I didn't have to anymore. I hung it in the entryway, next to Margaret's photo. On the 1-year anniversary of the slide, the community held a candlelight vigil along the rebuilt path. They invited me to speak. I didn't prepare anything. I just stood in front of them, familiar faces, now not strangers, and let the words come. We are shaped by the land we stand on, I said. But we also shape how we treat it and each other. What happened here wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a man-made one. Not because of shovels and machines, but because of arrogance and the refusal to listen. But what came after that was human too. Compassion, learning, repair. I looked out at them, candles flickering like stars. This hill once collapsed, I said. Now it holds us up. And that was it. The silence after wasn't empty, it was sacred. When they clapped, it wasn't loud. It was grateful. I walked home that night with a slow heart, a peaceful one. The battle with the HOA hadn't broken me. It had revealed me, not just as a man with warnings, but as a man with roots. And for the first time in years, Pine Hollow truly felt like home.